cold wind swept through the corridors of the White House on that January day in 1961, as the weight of a new administration settled heavily upon the shoulders of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The 35th President of the United States, barely a month into his tenure, stood at the precipice of a world teetering on the edge of nuclear confrontation. The youthful energy that had carried him to the highest office in the land was now tempered by the grim realities of Cold War politics. Washington, D.C. was a city alive with tension, quiet yet palpable, its streets shadowed by the looming threat of a global conflict that could erupt without warning. Kennedy's inauguration had been a moment of hope, a clarion call for change and renewal. Yet beneath the hopeful rhetoric lay a landscape scarred by escalating hostilities. The Cold War, that protracted struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, had reached a critical juncture. The recent downing of an American U-2 spy plane over Soviet territory had shattered any remaining illusions of détente. The incident was more than a mere military setback. It was a stark reminder of the razor-edge balance between peace and apocalypse. Intelligence reports flooded the new administration with grim assessments. Soviet missile deployments were increasing, their diplomatic posture growing more hostile. The ideological divide between East and West seemed less a chasm than a yawning abyss drawing ever wider. Within the Oval Office, Kennedy wrestled with the enormity of his task. His advisors urged caution, warning that the Soviets were neither to be underestimated nor provoked unnecessarily. Yet there was an undeniable urgency in the air, a demand from within the government and among the American public for decisive action. The specter of communism loomed large, especially in the Western Hemisphere, where Fidel Castro's recent seizure of power in Cuba posed a direct threat to U.S. interests. Kennedy understood that the eyes of the world were upon him. The choices he made in these early days could define not only his presidency but the future of global order. The White House itself seemed to echo the contradictions of the moment. Its historic walls, steeped in the legacy of previous leaders, now enclosed a young president grappling with a world transformed by nuclear weapons, espionage, and ideological warfare. The pressure was relentless. Each decision carried the potential for monumental consequence, each misstep a step closer to disaster. Kennedy's demeanor reflected this burden. His sharp mind and quick wit often shadowed by moments of introspection and doubt. He was acutely aware that the Cold War was not merely a contest of armies or missiles, but a battle for the soul of nations. Outside Washington, the mood was equally fraught. The American public, still recovering from the scars of World War II, watched with a mixture of fear and resolve. The Cold War was no longer a distant threat. It was a daily reality. Newsreels and newspapers conveyed images of Soviet parades, missile tests, and tense diplomatic encounters. The Iron Curtain, once a metaphor, had become a tangible barrier separating two worlds locked in perpetual antagonism. Within this atmosphere, Kennedy's youthful idealism collided with the hard-edged demands of realpolitik. Amidst this backdrop, the new administration set about crafting its response. The National Security Council convened regularly, debates raging over the proper balance between deterrence and diplomacy. Military leaders advocated for readiness and strength, while diplomats cautioned against actions that might escalate tensions beyond control. Intelligence briefings detailed Soviet capabilities and intentions, often shrouded in uncertainty and speculation. Kennedy listened intently, weighing each argument with the gravitas demanded by the moment. The pressure was not solely external. Within the administration, Kennedy faced the challenge of uniting a team composed of seasoned veterans and fresh faces. Figures such as Robert McNamara, the new Secretary of Defense, and John McCone, head of the CIA, brought their own perspectives and urgencies to the table. The young president had to assert his authority while remaining open to counsel, a delicate balance in an environment where mistakes could be fatal. The shadow of his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, loomed large, with his cautious, measured approach to the Soviet threat casting a long influence over policy discussions. Yet the times demanded more than caution. The Cold War was accelerating, and Kennedy's sense of history pressed upon him. He believed that America could not afford to appear weak or indecisive. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of democratic ideals against the encroachment of totalitarianism. His speeches echoed this conviction, rallying a nation to vigilance and resolve. But beneath the public confidence, Kennedy grappled with the uncertainties that dogged every decision. How to confront the Soviet menace without igniting the very war he sought to prevent. In the weeks following his inauguration, the administration's attention turned increasingly to Cuba. Fidel Castro's revolution had unsettled the region, and the island's growing ties with Moscow presented a direct challenge to American influence in the hemisphere. Intelligence assessments painted a picture of a Cuba moving closer to the Soviet sphere, a potential staging ground for communist expansion just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The specter of Soviet missiles stationed so near American shores was a nightmare scenario that haunted planners and policymakers alike. Kennedy's internal deliberations were marked by a tension between inherited caution and emergent urgency. The Bay of Pigs invasion plan, conceived during Eisenhower's presidency, was now on his desk. It promised a swift, covert operation aimed at toppling Castro and halting the communist tide. But it came with risks, political, military, and moral. The new president weighed the warnings embedded in the plan's assumptions against the mounting pressure to act decisively. The voices of his advisors pulled him in conflicting directions. Some urged boldness, others counseled prudence. Amid these debates, the young president's resolve hardened. He recognized that the Cold War was a game of high stakes, where hesitation could be as damaging as recklessness. The pressure to define his administration's approach to the Soviet challenge was immense. Kennedy's determination to project strength and confidence was not merely political posturing. It was a calculated response to a global crisis that demanded leadership of a rare order. The tension lingered in the halls of power. What remained was uncertainty, consequence, and the shadow of the Cold War. Kennedy's presidency was unfolding amid a world where every move was fraught with peril, every decision a gamble with history itself. The scene was set, the players in motion. The question was no longer whether the United States would act, but how it would navigate the treacherous waters that lay ahead. Dwight D. Eisenhower had left the presidency with a clear sense of caution etched into his approach to the Cold War. His tenure, marked by a cautious containment strategy, reflected a belief that measured responses and strategic patience were paramount in confronting the Soviet threat. Eisenhower had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of global conflict and understood the precarious balance of power that governed the era. His warnings to his successor were neither casual nor dismissible. They were grounded in a profound understanding of the risks that reckless action could invite. Privately, Eisenhower had conveyed to Kennedy a stern message. The Cold War was a conflict defined by subtleties and shadows, where overt aggression could spiral into catastrophe. He advised restraint, emphasizing the importance of intelligence gathering and covert operations over open military confrontation. The general-turned-president believed that the United States' strength lay not only in its armed forces but in its capacity for diplomacy and strategic calculation. His counsel was clear: provocations must be weighed with a keen eye toward long-term consequences. Publicly, Eisenhower maintained a composed demeanor, refraining from direct criticism of the incoming administration. Yet beneath this measured surface was a deep concern about the direction in which Kennedy might steer the nation. The former commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II had witnessed the rise of totalitarian regimes and knew the costs of miscalculation. His experience lent gravity to his advice, which was couched not in political rhetoric but in the language of military strategy and global stability. Eisenhower's approach to Cold War strategy was shaped by his military background and the geopolitical realities of the 1950s. He had championed the policy of containment, aiming to restrict Soviet expansion without provoking open warfare. His administration had invested heavily in intelligence capabilities, including the CIA and covert operations designed to undermine communist influence discreetly. This blend of caution and covert action was intended to preserve peace while maintaining American influence around the globe. The former president's warnings to Kennedy were particularly pointed regarding Cuba and the Soviet sphere of influence. Eisenhower saw the Caribbean as a critical front in the ideological battle, but he counseled against overt military interventions that might escalate tensions unnecessarily. He understood that Cuba's proximity to the United States made any confrontation fraught with danger, and he urged a careful assessment of the risks before committing to any bold moves. Eisenhower's belief in the importance of intelligence was a cornerstone of his strategic philosophy. He had overseen the expansion of the CIA's capabilities, advocating for operations that could destabilize hostile regimes without triggering open conflict. This preference for covert action over direct military engagement reflected his desire to avoid the mistakes of previous generations, where misjudgments had led to devastating wars. His advice to Kennedy was rooted in this framework: use intelligence, patience, and subtlety to outmaneuver the Soviets. Despite these warnings, Eisenhower was not opposed to taking firm action when necessary. His presidency had seen the deployment of nuclear deterrence as a central pillar of American defense. He recognized that strength was crucial, but it had to be wielded with prudence. The former general's strategic calculus favored a balance between demonstrating resolve and avoiding unnecessary provocations. He saw the Cold War as a protracted contest of wills rather than a battlefield for direct confrontation. Kennedy, for his part, absorbed Eisenhower's counsel with a mixture of respect and reservation. The young president understood the wisdom behind his predecessor's caution, but also felt the pressing need to assert American leadership in a rapidly shifting world. The Cold War was evolving, and new challenges demanded new responses. Kennedy's advisors were divided, some echoing Eisenhower's warnings, others urging a more assertive stance. This divergence set the stage for a complex interplay of advice and ambition. Eisenhower's personal relationship with Kennedy was marked by a sense of duty and concern. Though they belonged to the same party, their generational and experimental differences shaped their perspectives. Eisenhower saw in Kennedy a leader brimming with promise, but perhaps lacking the hard-earned prudence that years of command had instilled in him. His warnings were not merely strategic, but carried a paternal undertone, a hope that the new president would avoid the pitfalls of youthful impulsiveness. The former president's caution extended beyond policy to encompass the broader geopolitical risks. He was acutely aware that any misstep in the Cold War could trigger a chain reaction with global consequences. The nuclear arms race had introduced a new and terrifying dimension to international relations, where a single miscalculation might ignite a conflict of unprecedented scale. Eisenhower's advice to Kennedy was thus suffused with a sense of historical gravity. This was a gamble with history, a challenge to established wisdom that could not be taken lightly. In conversations behind closed doors, Eisenhower emphasized the need for a disciplined approach to Cold War strategy. He spoke of the importance of alliances, intelligence sharing, and the careful calibration of military and diplomatic tools. His experience in leading a coalition during World War II informed his belief in multilateral engagement and the avoidance of unilateral actions that might isolate the United States. This perspective underscored his warnings against precipitous moves in Cuba and elsewhere. Eisenhower's belief in covert operations as a preferred instrument of policy also shaped his advice on Cuba. He had authorized plans to undermine Castro's regime through clandestine means, believing that such efforts could achieve objectives without risking open war. His caution was rooted in an understanding of the complexities of Cuban politics and the dangers of provoking Soviet intervention. This nuanced view contrasted with the more straightforward, action-oriented impulses that would soon emerge within Kennedy's circle. The former president's strategic vision was not without its critics, who argued that his cautious approach risked allowing Soviet expansion to go unchecked. Yet Eisenhower held firm in his conviction that measured responses were essential to preserving peace. He had witnessed the devastation of global conflict and sought to avoid repeating those mistakes. His warnings to Kennedy were a reflection of this hard-earned wisdom, a plea for prudence in a world where the stakes were unimaginably high. As Kennedy grappled with these competing perspectives, he faced the challenge of defining his own approach to Cold War leadership. Eisenhower had warned, but the young president felt the weight of history pressing him to act decisively. The tension between Eisenhower's cautious legacy and Kennedy's emerging ambition would soon become a defining feature of the administration's policy debates. It was a divergence rooted in experience and temperament, strategy and urgency, a clash that would shape the trajectory of the Cold War in profound ways. Cuba's strategic significance during the Cold War was undeniable. A mere 90 miles from Florida's coast, the island emerged as a flashpoint where global ideologies clashed with fierce intensity. The rise of Fidel Castro, a revolutionary leader whose insurgency had toppled the Batista regime, sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington. Castro's swift alignment with the Soviet Union only deepened American fears, transforming Cuba from a distant concern into an immediate threat. For Kennedy and his advisors, the island was no longer a peripheral issue. It was a crucible demanding urgent and decisive action. The young president found himself navigating a labyrinth of intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and strategic assessments that painted a complex picture of Cuba's evolving role. Castro's government had rapidly consolidated power, suppressing dissent and embracing socialist reforms that antagonized US interests. More troubling was the growing military and economic support from Moscow, signaling a Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere that challenged the Monroe Doctrine's legacy. Kennedy's internal deliberations were marked by a growing sense of urgency: how to counter this communist expansion without triggering a wider conflict. Within the administration, debates simmered between those advocating for restraint and others pressing for intervention. The Bay of Pigs plan, inherited from Eisenhower's team, became central to these discussions. Originally conceived as a covert operation employing Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, the plan promised a swift and deniable method of dismantling the communist regime. Yet its risks were manifold. Failure could embolden the Soviets and humiliate the United States on the world stage. Kennedy's decision to greenlight the invasion was a calculated risk. a gamble that reflected both the inherited legacy and his own emerging leadership style. The president's deliberations revealed the tension between Eisenhower's cautious approach and the demands of a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. Kennedy was acutely aware that inaction might be perceived as weakness, inviting further Soviet encroachment. At the same time, he understood the perils of direct military engagement so close to home. The Bay of Pigs operation appeared to offer a middle path, an assertion of American resolve cloaked in plausible deniability. Yet beneath this calculation lurked uncertainty and doubt. Kennedy's advisors were divided. Figures such as Allen Dulles, then director of the CIA, championed the invasion, confident in the capabilities of the exile force and the expectation of popular Cuban support. Others cautioned that the operation underestimated Castro's strength and overestimated the likelihood of a popular uprising. These conflicting views underscored the complexity of the decision facing the president, a decision that would test his judgment and define his early presidency. The strategic importance of Cuba extended beyond its immediate geographic proximity. It was a symbol of the broader ideological contest, a battleground where the fate of hemispheric influence hung in the balance. For Kennedy, the imperative was clear: to prevent the spread of communism within the Americas and to demonstrate that the United States would not tolerate Soviet advances in its backyard. The Bay of Pigs plan, despite its risks, aligned with this imperative, embodying a desire to act decisively against a perceived existential threat. Yet Kennedy's choice to proceed with the invasion also reflected his determination to assert his authority and to break from the shadow of his predecessor. Though the plan was inherited, the responsibility for its execution and its consequences rested squarely on his shoulders. He took a risk, weighing the potential gains against the possible fallout. This decision was not made lightly, but the urgency of the moment and the pressures from within his administration propelled him forward. The Bay of Pigs operation was emblematic of the broader tension within Kennedy's leadership style, a blend of youthful ambition and a willingness to challenge established wisdom. He sought to demonstrate American strength and resolve, yet the complexities of Cold War geopolitics demanded a nuanced approach. The plan's reliance on covert action, combined with overt military engagement, reflected this duality. It was a gamble with history, a test of Kennedy's capacity to navigate the treacherous waters of Cold War diplomacy. As preparations for the invasion advanced, the administration's confidence was tempered by lingering doubts. Reports from the ground suggested that the anticipated popular uprising against Castro was less certain than hoped. The exile force, though trained and equipped, faced an entrenched and determined Cuban military. Intelligence estimates varied, and the margin for error was slim. Kennedy's advisors debated contingencies, but the ultimate decision rested with the president. The Bay of Pigs represented a critical moment in the Cold War narrative, a juncture where the aspirations of American leadership collided with the realities of international power dynamics. Kennedy's approval of the plan marked a departure from Eisenhower's more measured approach, signaling a willingness to engage more directly with the communist threat. Yet the operation's covert nature and its reliance on proxy forces revealed an underlying ambivalence, a desire to act boldly without overtly escalating the conflict. Within the Oval Office, Kennedy's resolve was tested. The decision to authorize the invasion was fraught with political and strategic risk. Success promised to bolster American credibility and weaken Soviet influence in the hemisphere. Failure risked international humiliation and the strengthening of Castro's regime. The pressure was immense, and the stakes were nothing less than the projection of American power and the preservation of hemispheric security. The Bay of Pigs plan also exposed the limits of intelligence and planning. The assumptions underpinning the operation, regarding Cuban resistance, popular support, and Soviet reaction, were optimistic at best. These miscalculations would soon become painfully apparent. Kennedy's gamble was a reflection of the broader challenges facing his administration, the need to balance boldness with prudence, action with caution, and ambition with realism. In approving the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy embraced a strategy that sought to assert American resolve in the face of communist expansion. Yet the operation's inherent risks and uncertainties underscored the fragile nature of Cold War diplomacy. The president's decision was a moment of profound political risk, one that would shape the trajectory of his administration and the broader contest with the Soviet Union. The tension between inherited plans and emerging leadership encapsulated the complex dynamics of the era. Kennedy's choice to move forward, despite Eisenhower's reservations, revealed a willingness to challenge established counsel. It was a defining moment, a blend of calculated risk and hopeful defiance that would soon confront the harsh realities of Cold War geopolitics. Kennedy's gamble on the Bay of Pigs invasion unfolded with a grim inevitability that none in the White House wished to confront openly. The plan, conceived in the shadows and approved with cautious optimism, was meant to be a swift stroke against Castro's regime, a demonstration of American resolve that would send a clear message to Moscow. Instead, it became a debacle that exposed the vulnerabilities of Kennedy's nascent administration and underscored the perils of disregarding seasoned counsel. The invasion commenced under the cloak of secrecy, with a force of Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA landing on the southern coast of Cuba. The expectation was that this incursion would ignite a popular uprising, destabilizing Castro's grip and paving the way for a rapid overthrow. But the reality was starkly different. The exile force met fierce resistance from a well-prepared Cuban military, supported by local militias fiercely loyal to the revolutionary government. The anticipated popular support failed to materialize. The Cuban people, wary of foreign intervention and committed to their leader, did not rise up as hoped. Within days, the operation unraveled. The exile force was overwhelmed, and the invasion quickly became a public relations disaster for the United States. The world watched as America's covert action was exposed, shattering the illusion of plausible deniability. The Kennedy administration faced a crisis not only of military failure but of credibility. The Bay of Pigs had not only failed to achieve its objectives, but it also handed Castro a propaganda victory that bolstered his regime's legitimacy. For Kennedy, the fallout was deeply personal. The young president bore the weight of responsibility for a decision that had gone catastrophically wrong. Yet, he did not succumb to despair. Instead, the failure steeled his resolve to confront the Soviet challenge with renewed vigor. The Bay of Pigs was a harsh lesson in the limits of covert operations and the dangers of underestimating both an adversary and the complexities of local politics. The invasion's failure also exposed fault lines within Kennedy's administration. The reliance on intelligence that proved overly optimistic, the underestimation of Castro's military capabilities, and the misreading of Cuban popular sentiment all pointed to systemic flaws. Kennedy's initial trust in his advisors was shaken, prompting a re-evaluation of decision-making processes and intelligence assessments. The Bay of Pigs had laid bare the risks of acting on incomplete or flawed information. Internationally, the fallout was equally significant. The Soviet Union seized upon the failure as evidence of American aggression and weakness. Castro's Cuba became an even more significant client state of Moscow, deepening the Cold War's divisions in the Western Hemisphere. The invasion emboldened Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who interpreted the debacle as a sign of American vulnerability to be exploited in future confrontations. Domestically, Kennedy faced criticism from political opponents and allies alike. The Bay of Pigs became a symbol of youthful inexperience and overreach, a stain on the administration's early record. Yet Kennedy's response was marked by a mixture of accountability and defiance. He took responsibility publicly but also resolved to learn from failure, to sharpen his leadership and strategic approach. The experience forged a more cautious yet determined president, one who recognized that the Cold War was a high-stakes game requiring both boldness and prudence. The invasion's failure also had profound implications for U.S. policy and Cold War strategy. It underscored the limits of covert action as a tool for regime change and highlighted the need for greater coordination between intelligence agencies and military planners. The Bay of Pigs became a catalyst for reform within the CIA and the broader national security apparatus, prompting efforts to improve intelligence accuracy and operational planning. Kennedy's decision to proceed with the Bay of Pigs, despite Eisenhower's warnings, set in motion a trajectory that intensified US-Soviet tensions. The failure hardened Kennedy's stance, pushing him toward a more confrontational posture that would define subsequent crises. The president's resolve to counter Soviet influence grew, informed by the bitter lessons of the invasion's fallout. This shift would soon manifest in policies that escalated the Cold War's dangers but also demonstrated American resolve. The Bay of Pigs was a moment of reckoning, a stark reminder of the costs of political gambles in a nuclear age. Kennedy's gamble had failed, but it also clarified the stakes and the challenges ahead. The invasion's fallout reverberated through the corridors of power, shaping the contours of US foreign policy and the dynamics of Cold War confrontation. In the aftermath, Kennedy convened his advisors with renewed urgency, seeking to recalibrate strategy and avoid repeating past mistakes. The administration's focus shifted to strengthening intelligence capabilities, improving military readiness, and exploring diplomatic avenues to counter Soviet influence. The Bay of Pigs had not diminished Kennedy's determination. Rather, it had refined his understanding of the Cold War's complexities. The invasion's failure also deepened the personal and political divide between Kennedy and Eisenhower's legacy. The former president's caution now appeared more prescient, while Kennedy's willingness to take risks was both a source of criticism and a defining trait of his leadership. The tension between these approaches would continue to shape the administration's policies and its engagement with the Soviet Union. The Bay of Pigs episode was more than a military fiasco. It was a crucible in which Kennedy's presidency was tested and transformed. The humiliation and setbacks served as a catalyst for growth, forcing the young leader to confront the harsh realities of Cold War power politics. The experience sharpened his instincts and fortified his resolve to meet the Soviet challenge with a blend of strength and strategic calculation. As the dust settled, the consequences of the invasion lingered. US credibility had been damaged, Soviet influence in Cuba had solidified, and the Cold War's intensity had escalated. Yet, amid the fallout, Kennedy emerged with a clearer vision of the stakes and the demands of leadership in this perilous era. The Bay of Pigs was a gamble with history, one that had not paid off, but one that would shape the course of the Cold War and Kennedy's presidency in profound ways. The Bay of Pigs invasion had deepened the chasm between Kennedy's bold, sometimes impulsive approach and Eisenhower's preference for prudence and strategic patience. This divergence was more than a difference in policy. It was a clash of temperaments and experiences that shaped the contours of Cold War leadership. Eisenhower, the seasoned general and measured statesman, had long advocated for caution, a steady hand guiding a fragile peace. Kennedy, the youthful president, driven by urgency and a desire to assert American strength, charted a course that often defied his predecessor's counsel. Eisenhower watched the unfolding events with a mix of disappointment and restraint. Though he refrained from public rebuke, his private reflections were tinged with concern. The former commander-in-chief understood the pressures facing Kennedy but questioned the wisdom of such overt ventures into risky territory. His caution was born of experience, of battles fought and alliances forged, and a recognition of the unpredictable consequences that could arise from miscalculations in an era shadowed by nuclear threat. The relationship between the two men was complex, marked by respect yet tempered by fundamental differences in outlook. Eisenhower had hoped that his warnings would guide Kennedy toward a more measured approach. Instead, he saw the young president embracing a posture that, while courageous, flirted with recklessness. This tension between caution and boldness was emblematic of the broader struggles within the US government as it grappled with the demands of Cold War leadership. Within Kennedy's administration, efforts were made to bridge this divide. Advisors and diplomats sought to temper the president's ambitions with pragmatic assessments, urging a balance between assertiveness and restraint. Yet the momentum toward a more aggressive stance was difficult to halt. The Bay of Pigs failure, rather than inducing retreat, seemed to harden Kennedy's resolve to confront the Soviet challenge head-on. The administration's posture shifted, embracing a policy that combined covert action, military readiness, and diplomatic pressure. Eisenhower's influence, though diminished, remained a subtle undercurrent in policy debates. His emphasis on intelligence and covert operations as tools of foreign policy continued to shape discussions, even as Kennedy's team pushed for more overt measures. This interplay of ideas reflected the evolving nature of Cold War strategy, a contest not only between superpowers but between competing visions within American leadership itself. The strain between Eisenhower's caution and Kennedy's ambition also played out in the broader context of US foreign policy. Allies and adversaries alike observed these shifts, interpreting them as signals of American intent and resolve. The delicate balance of deterrence and diplomacy required careful calibration, and internal divisions complicated this task. Kennedy's willingness to take risks introduced new uncertainties into an already volatile international environment. Despite their differences, Eisenhower maintained a public posture of respect and restraint. He refrained from overt criticism, mindful of the political and diplomatic consequences of open dissent. Yet his private disappointment was palpable, a recognition that the path chosen by Kennedy carried significant risks. The former president's reflections underscored the challenges of leadership during a period when missteps could have catastrophic consequences. The administration's pursuit of a more aggressive posture was not without its advocates. Some advisors argued that Eisenhower's caution had allowed Soviet influence to expand unchecked, and that a firmer stance was necessary to protect American interests. This faction saw in Kennedy a leader willing to take the necessary risks to confront communism decisively. The resulting policy was a complex amalgam of inherited strategies and new initiatives, reflecting the tensions within the administration. Efforts to reconcile these competing approaches were ongoing but fraught. Diplomatic channels sought to manage tensions with the Soviet Union, while military and intelligence agencies prepared for potential escalation. The interplay between public diplomacy and covert operations became a defining feature of the era, as the United States navigated a path between confrontation and negotiation. Within this context, Kennedy's leadership style emerged as a defining factor. His willingness to challenge established wisdom, to embrace calculated risks, set him apart from Eisenhower's measured approach. This boldness inspired confidence among some but raised alarms among others. The tension between these perspectives revealed the complexities of governing in an age where the stakes were existential. Eisenhower's legacy as a cautious architect of Cold War strategy contrasted sharply with Kennedy's emerging image as a decisive, risk-taking leader. This contrast was not merely generational but rooted in differing assessments of the international environment and the nature of American power. Eisenhower's experience had taught him the value of restraint. Kennedy's challenges demanded a more assertive posture. The strain between these approaches influenced not only policy but also the internal dynamics of the administration. Trust and communication between Kennedy and his advisors were tested as debates intensified over the direction of Cold War strategy. The Bay of Pigs episode had exposed vulnerabilities in decision-making processes, prompting efforts to strengthen coordination and oversight. Yet the underlying tension between caution and ambition persisted. Eisenhower's private reflections conveyed a sense of regret tempered by understanding. He recognized the burdens borne by Kennedy, the pressures to demonstrate strength in a world fraught with danger. Yet he remained convinced that the path of prudence was the safer course, a course that might prevent the escalation of conflict and preserve the fragile peace. Kennedy's response to Eisenhower's caution was neither dismissal nor blind defiance. Rather, it was a complex negotiation between inherited wisdom and emergent necessity. He sought to learn from past mistakes while asserting his own vision of leadership. This balancing act defined much of his presidency, as he grappled with the demands of Cold War crisis management. The growing divergence between Eisenhower's and Kennedy's approaches underscored the challenges of leadership during this tense period. It highlighted the difficulties of navigating a geopolitical landscape where the margin for error was vanishingly small. The interplay between caution and boldness, between experience and ambition, shaped not only policy outcomes but the very character of American engagement in the Cold War. In this tense atmosphere, the legacy of Eisenhower's warnings lingered. His counsel, though not always heeded, served as a sobering reminder of the stakes involved. Kennedy's willingness to chart a different course carried profound risks and potential rewards, reflecting the high-stakes gamble that defined the era. The internal struggle between these competing visions of leadership was a microcosm of the broader Cold War conflict, a contest of wills, strategies, and philosophies. It revealed the complexities of governing in a world where every decision carried the weight of possible catastrophe. The tension between caution and ambition would continue to shape the unfolding drama of the Cold War, influencing the decisions and destinies of nations on the brink. The long-term consequences of Kennedy's decision to disregard Eisenhower's counsel were complex and far-reaching, casting a shadow over the early years of his presidency and reverberating throughout the Cold War's precarious landscape. The immediate setbacks, the Bay of Pigs disaster foremost among them, served as stark reminders of the costs inherent in political gambles. Yet, paradoxically, these failures also forged a harder, more determined Kennedy, one who grasped with greater clarity the brutal calculus of global power. Kennedy's resolve to confront the Soviet Union with firmness grew out of the ashes of the invasion's failure. The humiliation was profound, but it galvanized a shift toward a more assertive and, at times, confrontational posture. The lessons learned, the perils of over-reliance on flawed intelligence, the complexities of foreign popular support, and the need for seamless coordination between military and intelligence agencies were seared into the administration's consciousness. These insights informed the decisions that would shape subsequent crises, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy's tempered yet resolute leadership would be put to its ultimate test. Yet the story of these years is not merely one of failure or success, but of the delicate balance between caution and boldness that defines leadership in moments of profound uncertainty. Eisenhower's warnings, though set aside, retained their haunting relevance. They underscored the fine line between prudent restraint and reckless daring, a line that Kennedy would have to walk repeatedly. The Cold War was a game of shadows and gambits, where missteps could ignite conflagrations that no leader wished to see. The interplay between caution and audacity shaped the legacies of both men. Eisenhower's measured approach reflected a desire to preserve peace through strength and subtlety, emphasizing covert operations and diplomatic patience. Kennedy's willingness to take calculated risks embodied a youthful ambition to reshape the world order and assert American primacy. Each approach bore its own costs and rewards, and each left an indelible mark on the course of history. Their divergent paths illustrate the perennial dilemma faced by leaders confronting existential threats. how to balance the imperative to act decisively with the necessity to avoid catastrophe. Kennedy's gambles, though fraught with peril, demonstrated the courage to confront adversity head-on. Eisenhower's caution, tempered by experience, highlighted the value of restraint in a world where the stakes were global and irreversible. The lessons of this era extend beyond their immediate historical context. They invite reflection on the nature of leadership itself, the burdens of decision-making under uncertainty, the tension between inherited wisdom and emergent challenges, and the profound consequences of choices made in moments of crisis. The Cold War gamble between Kennedy and Eisenhower is a testament to the complexity of governance when history hangs in the balance. As the Cold War unfolded, the legacies of these two men became entwined in the broader narrative of American leadership. Their differing philosophies, while at times in conflict, collectively shaped the policies that would confront the Soviet challenge for decades. The tension between their approaches underscored the dynamic and often fraught nature of strategic decision-making in a nuclear age. In the final analysis, the story of Kennedy's disregard of Eisenhower's advice is a story of risk and consequence, a narrative of ambition, caution, and the heavy costs of political gambles. It is a reminder that leadership, especially in times of geopolitical upheaval, demands both vision and humility, decisiveness and deliberation. The Cold War era these leaders navigated was defined by uncertainty and danger, yet also by moments of profound courage and conviction. The decisions made in those years, shaped by conflicting counsel and competing imperatives, offer enduring lessons about the perils and possibilities of power. They reveal the intricate dance of diplomacy and strategy, the challenges of steering a nation through perilous waters, and the enduring human dimensions of political leadership. In contemplating their legacies, one is struck by the weight of history pressing upon their shoulders, the burden of choices that could alter the fate of nations. Eisenhower's caution and Kennedy's daring were not simply policy preferences but reflections of character and circumstance. Together, they embody the complex interplay of forces that shaped the Cold War and, by extension, the modern world. This narrative invites further exploration of the personalities and policies that defined an era marked by tension and transformation. It calls upon us to consider the lessons of prudence and risk, to understand the costs of ignoring counsel, and to appreciate the demands placed upon those who must decide the course of history in moments when the stakes could not be higher.